You're listening to Soundside. I'm Jed Kim, editor for Soundside, and I'm filling in for Libby Dankman today. It's getting harder for unhoused people in Tacoma to find a place to spend the night. Last week, the city council there voted narrowly, 5-4, to expand buffer zones where encampments are not allowed. The original bans were passed in late 2022. They barred camping within 10 blocks of temporary shelters. The new ban, which went into effect this week, adds more buffers, including areas within 2 blocks of public schools, parks, and libraries. Proponents of the ban say this is a services-first approach that will increase the amount of help given to the unhoused. Critics say this simply reduces options for where people can sleep. Cameron Sheppard is a reporter covering homelessness in Pierce County for the Tacoma News Tribune. He joins us now. Hi, Cameron.
Hi, Jed. Thanks for having me.
So the initial ban by the city council went into effect in 2023. What was the reasoning from the city council for that decision?
Yeah, so I think at the time there were these couple large encampments that they said were pretty difficult to be able to access and offer outreach in. And I think residents in the city were kind of tired of it. And so the initial ban was basically to try and break those up and also, within these 10 block buffer zones, I think the rationale was, well, if you're within 10 blocks of a shelter, we have a place for you to go and it should be easy for you to not have to camp there.
That was a way of justifying you can't camp here when there is somewhere you can sleep.
Exactly. Yes.
So this was sold as a services first approach. What does that mean?
So the as part of this policy, the city put together a homeless outreach team known as the HEAL team. It started out with I think about 4 full-time employees and has now grown to 8. But basically what they do is they go to the encampments and they offer water and basic kind of supplies to people and also offer them services or help them get into shelter if they want to. At the same time, they're also kind of giving them notice like, hey, this encampment is going to be removed. They're often accompanied by police or followed by police. That's kind of the city's way of offering services is through these 8 full-time employees now that are called based on where encampments are.
I see. So they would go to those original buffer zones, talk to people, say you ought to be heading to a shelter, and if not, you're going to be possibly picked up.
Yeah, exactly.
So they were offering to get people into shelter. How many people were taking them up on that?
That's kind of the interesting part is the city self-reports their rate of what they call interest in services. It's not totally clear what that means, whether they're just saying, yeah, I'm interested in services. I don't know if that directly connects to them getting services, but since it's been into place, there's been a 50% overall rate of interest in services, whatever that means. Then they've had an 11% overall shelter acceptance rate. So that means they actually got somebody into shelter. Now, within the last year, both of those rates kind of saw a little bit of an increase. And that's tied to also a much smaller fraction of the contacts actually made in 2025. So in 2024, during the third quarter, there is almost 1,200 contacts that the HEAL team made. In the third quarter of 2025, there was 359. So it's hard to say that those increase in rates aren't tied to a much smaller sample size. And I think a big reason for that smaller sample size is that the city lost about 5 buffer zones where the HEAL team would emphasize its efforts. So it's down to like 4 buffer zones as well as some other areas. They also do contact outside of the buffer zones, but that's where the emphasis of their work is.
So I want to make sure I've got this right. So the HEAL team would go out and offer to help people get into services, and there is an indication that there has been an increase in the number of people accepting those services since they went into effect. And there was a big jump in the past year, but because of the smaller sample size, it's kind of hard to know what those numbers really mean.
Yeah, it's hard to compare it to previous years. I mean, it's like a quarter of what they've done in previous years. So it's hard to say those things aren't related.
Now we have this expansion of the buffer zones that's gone into effect. What's changed that led the city council to enact the new ban?
Yeah, so the city lost, yeah, I believe it's 5 buffer zones from 2024 to 2025. Those buffer zones are also shelters. So the shelters closed. We lost about 200 beds in 2025 due to anticipated budgeting shortfalls. And so with those lost buffer zones, John Hines, he's running for mayor on city council member who proposed this, said that loss of those buffer zones has led to kind of an increase in encampments in those previously protected areas. And so that's kind of the impetus for why he brought this forward.
So, going through the logic there, lost some shelters, temporary shelters, because of funding issues, and with that, you lose the 10 block radius buffer zone that says you can't camp there because there's a shelter. No more shelter, no more buffer zone. Instead of, well, why not try to put a shelter in?
And that is kind of the reason for the folks on the council that voted against this said exactly that is like Deputy Mayor Kiara Daniels was basically saying she couldn't say yes to this because we're not at a point where she felt like we have invested enough in other services to justify expanding the camping ban. And same sentiment echoed by Joe Bushnell, who basically was saying that there needs to be more low barrier shelter like what we lost during 2025 to be able to offer folks a place to go because there's a capacity issue. And the other interesting thing is Tacoma has the majority of shelter and services for people living unhoused. And some of the advocates for the unhoused have said that this is going to force them outside of the city to where there is no services. And it's really just kicking the can.
I am playing a bit of devil's advocate because, I mean, obviously it takes a lot to put in a shelter into an area. It's not like a simple matter of just like throwing one up there. But what you just said makes me wonder, like, I'm not that familiar with Tacoma's geography. How much of the city is outside of a buffer zone?
So the exact percentage is something that nobody's really identified yet, but this increases the amount of areas where camping would not be allowed significantly. Expands it to public parks, 2 blocks from public parks, public schools, and libraries. It also creates basically entire swaths of buffer zone through the downtown area, as well as the Hilltop neighborhood, which are both areas that anecdotally a lot of people would notice that there's a lot of encampments in those neighborhoods.
So then the question of where they're going to go, and you mentioned that people fear it's going to push people out of the city. I mean, there are council members that seem aware that this is a problem. Well, one of the council members, Sarah Rumbaugh, who co-sponsored the ban, she also passed a resolution to look for a new temporary site. What are those details?
Yeah, so the resolution basically directs city staff to look for options for a low barrier stability site. Where that will be is unclear. It directs them to look for it with and report back to the city within 60 days. And there's some language in the resolution that seem to suggest that they might be looking for partners outside of the city. There's some rhetoric within the city council about how kind of they feel like Tacoma's bearing the load as far as providing the broad majority of homelessness services and shelter. And I think there's some folks that think that it attracts unhoused folks into the city. And I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, but there are some data points that suggest that a lot of the folks in the point in time count earlier this year, a good deal of folks identified themselves as coming from an outside zip code or city and being counted inside of the city at that time.
Let's talk about the HEAL team and their mission because you've got more buffer zones now that are going to be put into place. Is there going to be an attendant increase in resources for their work?
And this was a question I asked the city, as well as John Hines, and they both kind of maintain that the job will be the same for the HEAL team. And that's kind of difficult for me to imagine considering the amount of space that they're now in theory going to be asked to respond to. And when I asked John Hines if he would consider down the road maybe expanding the amount of people that work on the heel team, he didn't really shut the door on that possibility. But it seems, especially within the last year, them reporting improved rates of interest in services and shelter placement. And that seems to be tied to a smaller sample size and them focusing on contacting less people. So it does kind of put into question how those rates could be affected if they're now making far more contacts.
The proponents of the ban, they were really pointing to the contacts that the Hill team is making as justification for doing this.
Yeah, they're definitely treating the heel team as if it's been an increasingly successful endeavor of the city. And once again, like within the last year, there's some metrics to show that. There's also a lot of metrics that are still kind of troubling about whether or not this approach is making a huge difference as far as mitigating homelessness in Tacoma and Pierce County. The difficult part about this population is it's really hard to find and collect data. In many ways, the unhoused are like kind of this invisible population. But the metrics that we do have, like looking at the point in time count, like since this has been into effect, homelessness has not decreased in the region. In fact, it's increased. We've lost the shelters in the last year, and I think part of what the city was expecting to do when they stood up all these shelters during the pandemic was to bring different kinds of transitional and supportive housing to develop that and improve kind of the spectrum of what's available to people. But it doesn't seem like we've kind of quite met that demand, and we still close the shelters anyway. So it's kind of seems like it could be a precarious situation that the city's in.
I want to ask one more thing. The Heal team is, they're not the only outreach groups in the city.
Mm-hmm.
So what are those other groups? What are their opinions of what the city is doing?
So there's a lot of people in the city of Tacoma that are working doing homeless outreach for nonprofits, volunteer groups, and they're really doing this work every day. And for them, their job is to build relationships with folks living out on the street and to earn trust and build rapport. And they've told me that they've been kind of frustrated with the city's approach to encampment removals because when they're developing a relationship with somebody and trying to get them to finally accept services, if the city's heal team shows up and forces them out of where they are, then they no longer can track where those people are. And so it's kind of like their work's being set back to square one. So there's definitely some frustrations. There's been frustrations in the past, and there's definitely frustrations right now with what the city is doing.
I mean, homelessness it's very, very difficult. There are no easy answers, or else we would have done it. At the same time, you have closed shelters, expansion of buffer zones. There's a lot to balance. You've got concerns about safety, and I just wonder, like, what's your takeaway about from how the city council has chosen to pursue this?
I think there's a lot of people, normal everyday people, that are frustrated with just having to see people live on the street in their community. And I think expanding a camping ban is something that is frankly politically popular. And I think the timing of it to have it go through in a matter of weeks, this proposal, in right ahead of the election, John Hines is running for mayor. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think the people that are frustrated with it are a very vocal minority. The people that are doing the outreach work every day, I think are rightfully frustrated. And I think when you look at the metrics of whether or not this is mitigating the homelessness crisis or has thus far, it's hard to support that it has.
Cameron Sheppard, reporter covering homelessness in Pierce County for Tacoma News Tribune. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.